Welcome to the third of our leader interviews. We're here at the Francis Crick Institute at King's Cross in central London. When construction and fitting out are complete here, this will be one enormous biomedical research centre. Top scientists will come here to put their minds to curing diseases. Before they arrive, though, we're using this remarkable location to meet top politicians to hear their thoughts on curing the country's ills. Today, Ed Miliband, leader of the Labour Party, is in the chair. Ed Miliband, I'd like to start with some of the judgments that have been made over this Parliament. There have been lots of arguments about economic policy and other things. Can we just look back at some of them? Let's start on jobs. Now, at the beginning of the Parliament, Ed Balls, Shadow Chancellor, said it was fantasy to think we'd get job growth with all the cuts being made in the public sector. What's happened to jobs over the last 5 years?
I think what Ed Balls was doing was quoting what the Office of Budget Responsibility and many people were saying, which is there'd be a very, very big impact on public sector jobs, and there were deep questions about whether the private sector jobs could make up the shortfall. Now, but it does go to the big argument of this election. You know, the Conservative Party want to say the economy's fixed and everything's fine because there are more jobs in our economy. I don't believe that. I think that too many of the jobs are insecure,
but
low-paid.
What's happened to the number of jobs? Because the judgment was about the number of jobs.
The number of jobs has gone up. But, you know, Evan, I'm going to let people in this election make the judgment about whether that means the economy's fixed or not.
Well, it's gone up by about 2 million, hasn't it? About 1,000 a day. Let's take crime. Yvette Cooper said, the government are taking a gamble with crime and policing, just as they're taking a gamble with the economy. They're cutting too far and too fast. They're risking growth and jobs. And now they're risking public safety and the fight against crime. What's happened on crime?
Well,
in the last 5
violent crime's
years?
actually up. So there are worries about violent crime, and there are big questions about what's going to happen to policing in the next Parliament. But you know,
what has happened to crime overall?
Well,
I mean, reported crimes are up in some areas, and there are questions over whether reported crime is the right measure of those, because people. But, I mean, you're
definitely right that there is a number of statistics that the government cites to say everything's fine in the country and everything's doing well.
What has happened to crime?
I want to. Certain areas of crime has gone down. Certain areas of crime have gone up. But let's go to the big argument of this election: is the country fixed or is the country not fixed? Now, I don't believe.
I'm just asking about crime. What's happened to crime?
Well, I said some areas of crime have fallen.
Well, the Crime Survey of England and Wales, which is taken as the best measure generally, estimates crimes at its lowest level since the study began in 1981. Let's take another one. This is tuition fees. Chuka Amuna, speaking in 2010 when the government put up tuition fees in England, he said, how can these proposals do other than deter people from poor backgrounds from going to university? What has happened to the number of poor people going to university, people from poorer backgrounds?
Well, what I know is that there are about 12 times more people from advantaged, privileged backgrounds going to university than disadvantaged backgrounds.
What's happened in the last 5 years?
And that isn't good enough for me in the country. But look.
But what's happened to those from poorer backgrounds?
There are some more people going to university from different backgrounds.
It's gone up. It's gone up by a third in the last 5 years.
And so the problem's fixed, is it?
I'm not saying it's fixed.
No, exactly, but that goes to the argument. Let me break this point.
The judgment that was made,
I understand,
was wrong.
No, I understand. No, it wasn't wrong, and let me explain why.
But you said
because it isn't good enough.
People.
It isn't good enough for me that you're 12 times more likely to get to university from an advantaged compared to a disadvantaged background, Evan. And that goes to the big argument of this election. Is this good enough for Britain? Is it good enough for Britain in jobs, in policing, in educational opportunity? I say no. I say we can be a country that's actually run for working people, not for the richest and most powerful, and that is still the state of Britain. And you know what? On May the 7th, let me make this point. On May the 7th, the public will reach their judgment about that. So you can definitely read off a whole list of statistics. Government ministers,
reading off your judgment.
Government ministers do it. David Cameron does it opposite me in the House of Commons. But I don't think that actually speaks to what's happening in people's living rooms up and down this country. But we're going to find out soon enough in 2.5 weeks' time.
So on issues about jobs, crime, social mobility, comments, predictions made by people in your team turn out to have been wrong. These are important areas. These are not minor quibbles, are they? These are huge issues that have had a large part to play in the last 5 years.
I don't think that's the judgment people are going to make at the election.
Let's look ahead. Let's go to borrowing and the deficit. Now, You have set out a budget responsibility lock to establish fiscal credibility. You want to get the deficit down. We're clear about that. And there are various sentences that you and your team use repeatedly to tell us what the policy is. But still there's a slight lack of clarity, isn't there? And I just want to cut through this. Is it right to say that compared to the plans that the Conservative Party have, whether they meet their plans is a different question, compared to the plans, you will spend more than the Conservatives and you will borrow more and be doing so at the end of the Parliament?
Well, let me set out what our plans actually are, because I think it's important that people at home know what they are. It's to have a surplus on the current budget. That means that day-to-day spending is more than covered by tax revenues. Secondly, that net debt is going to be falling, so that's debt as a proportion of national income. And thirdly, something very, very important, which is, you know, in a way is a judgment on our manifesto. Not a penny of what we're promising is funded by extra borrowing. Unlike the Conservative Party, who are promising £25 billion more.
Right, now look, I want to be honest, I've actually written out those sentences you've used, and I've got it before we got here. We'll cut the deficit every year. You hadn't said, but that was one I had written. We'll get national debt falling, surplus on the current budget as soon as possible in the next Parliament. Everything in our manifestos is costed. But you haven't answered the question as to whether borrowing at the end of the Parliament, whether borrowing will be bigger than the Conservative plan.
I'll tell you why I don't believe it will, because the Conservatives said they would eliminate the deficit in this Parliament, and they failed to do so. So they've made the spending cuts, but they haven't cut the deficit as promised. And I think the same would be true in the next Parliament. But let me answer
bigger than their plans.
Let me set out.
We can question
but I don't
whether
believe
their
plans. I don't
right.
believe their plans. Let me set out the differences I see at the election. There are some people who come along and say there don't need to be any cuts, right? I'm not one of those people. I've set out very clearly there need to be reductions. I'm the first Labour leader going into an election saying outside key protected areas like health and education, spending is actually going to be falling. There's another plan, the Tory plan, that says you should accelerate the spending cuts, double the cuts next year. I think ours is a balanced plan which involves reductions in spending and involves tax changes, like, for example, reversing David Cameron's millionaires' tax cut.
It doesn't sound like you have a plan, though, because what you're unable to do is to tell me how much you will be borrowing on current economic projections. We know these projections go awry and that there may be more, maybe less, but you're unable to tell me how much you will be borrowing at the end of the Parliament.
Well, I can make this assurance. I'll make this assurance, right, which is that we're going to have a surplus on the current budget and net debt falling as soon as possible in the next Parliament. I want to go to this issue of as soon as possible because this is the issue here. George Osborne set a lot of timetables, set a lot of dates, right? He missed most of those dates. I think, and I made a speech on this in December on our deficit plan, I think the sensible thing to do is to set a framework for fiscal policy over the course of the coming Parliament, and that's what we've done.
Look, I'm going to... There are two deficits, right? There's the current one, which you say you're going to get rid of, and there's the other one left, the capital one. There'll be water in this glass. This is borrowing to cover capital spending. The Conservatives say both those glasses will be empty. You've said
I don't
they
believe
won't
it's going to
achieve it.
happen.
Right. Well, that's a question we must put to them. How much, within 10 billion, do you expect to be in that second glass by the end of the Parliament?
Well,
how much is going to be left in there?
Let me explain why
that's
not a sensible question. Let me explain. It isn't. Let me explain why. You know it's not. Let me explain why. Look, we're going to have a surplus on the current budget, right? We want it.
I've dealt with that.
Let me answer the question. We want a surplus on the current budget as soon as possible in the next Parliament. Now, what does that depend on? We're going to make spending reductions, set out the tax changes we're going to make, but it depends crucially on something else, which is economic growth. Why have the Tories failed on the deficit in this Parliament? Because they made the cuts, but because they didn't get the growth, the rise in living standards, tax revenues fell, and they didn't meet it. So I'm not going to play your game with the glass of water. It's very inventive. Well done.
After the election, if you have a budget, you're going to make financial projections over the next 5 years, and you will tell us how much you expect to be in that glass.
I'm going to do something more than that.
And you're unable to tell us that now.
No, I'm going to do something more than that. I'm going to tell you the first line of Labour's first budget, which is that we're going to
get the deficit down every year.
But that's quite significant,
yes.
isn't it?
That's the other glass. We're going to cut
or
is that both glasses or the other glass?
We're going to cut the deficit every year, and we're going to have a surplus on the current budget
as
soon as possible in the next
that
Parliament.
You keep repeating. Okay, so I think your supporters will be deeply disappointed that you are
I don't think they will.
Deeply disappointed that you are apparently so embarrassed about your policy to borrow more than the Conservatives are planning to do, that you actually can't utter the words, we will borrow more, because that is the right
But
thing to do.
you know why I don't believe it? I mean, you know, look, we've got a sensible plan on the deficit, which is to balance the books.
But
they want to go
you
much.
can't utter the words.
They want to go much further. But let me just tell you why I'm not going to do what you're asking me to do, because remember at the beginning of this Parliament, you were talking about predictions. They didn't just make a prediction; they made a promise that they would clear the deficit in this Parliament. Now they failed. Now that goes to the big.
Within 10 billion.
No, but
experts are all saying it's 30 billion is the difference between you and the Conservatives.
Let me make this point, Evan, because it is very relevant to people at home. I'll tell you why this is important. Because why did they fail? Right? They failed because they didn't understand that you can't simply cut your way to deficit reduction. You've got to get a growing economy, rising living standards, and therefore the right thing to do, credibility, you know about these issues, credibility matters in fiscal policy. The way you get credibility is not picking...
Exactly.
Let me make the point. But not by picking out an arbitrary number today in 6 years' time. If you were, you'd be, if I was doing that, you'd be saying, come on, Mr. Miliband, you're picking out an arbitrary number, doesn't make sense. It's to set a clear framework.
A better plan. Your slogan is a better plan. And generally, it is thought of as
a better plan.
Is offering a fiscal path for the next few years, a path of borrowing, and you're unable to do that. Nicola Sturgeon has no problem in saying she believes in more borrowing and more spending. She doesn't like the Tory way.
Right. I don't agree with Nicola.
But your policy is to borrow more. Lots of experts think your policy is better than the Conservative policy.
But that's an important point. Let me just explain the three positions. There is what you call Nicola Sturgeon's position. She says no cuts are necessary. There's the Tory plan, which is to double the cuts next year. I don't think that's a sensible position. And there's our plan, which is a sensible plan.
Right. A lot of the credibility that is so important you have built up over the last 5 years has been with Ed Balls, your Shadow Chancellor. Can you assure us that he will be Chancellor if you form the next government?
Well, I've always said that I don't do measuring the curtains because, you know, my focus is on up to May the 7th. I think Ed Balls is an excellent Shadow Chancellor. I think you can take it from my answer, what I'm planning to do. I'm not going to start appointing members of my cabinet. But I think Ed Balls has shown over the last 4 years and in this campaign that he is somebody who's not just capable of being Chancellor, but an excellent Chancellor.
Why can't you just tell us? I mean, you know,
because I don't do
it was clear with David Cameron.
Sure, I'm giving you a pretty clear indication, but I don't do measuring the curtains. I don't do starting appointing my cabinet because I think it's presumptuous. I think the British people have got a big decision to make. I'm giving you a very clear indication.
Right. Scotland. On your watch as leader of the Labour Party, something huge has happened there. I think at the last election, Labour got, about twice the votes of the SNP. In the polls now, the SNP have about twice the votes of the Labour Party. Your personal standing in the polls there is behind David Cameron. Do you take responsibility for what's happening there?
Of course I take responsibility for everything that's happening in the election and that's happened over the last 5 years. I think what we saw in Scotland was, in the referendum, a deeply, if you like, divisive moment. A moment that divided Scotland, 45-55, yes versus no. I think one of our tasks is to show people that this election is not a rerun of the referendum. It's about something else. It's about, do you have a Labour government or a Conservative government? There are lots of people in Scotland who don't want a Conservative government. I'm urging them to vote Labour, but also because of the commitments we're making to build a country that properly works for working people. I think it's the big argument of this election. And I think people in Scotland are actually on our side in the kind of country they want to build. And I hope they'll vote Labour for a higher minimum wage, to ban the exploitation of zero-hours contracts, to have a mansion tax on the most expensive properties above £2 million, to help fund the health service across the UK. Right. I'm a deep believer in the United Kingdom. I'm a believer in more devolution, but also that we are stronger together, and that's about solidarity and redistribution.
Now, if you're the biggest party in Parliament, but you're not the biggest in England, and you effectively end up ruling England only with the support, through a deal or through no deal, you end up ruling England with the support of the SNP, is there going to be all hell to pay, do you think, in England?
I don't do hypotheticals.
Well, you do. You've talked about you're not going to do a coalition with the SNP.
No, that's because the Conservatives were spreading a ridiculous falsehood. But look, honestly,
well, they're going to. You've addressed one hypothetical.
We've got 2.5 weeks to go till the general election. I take an old-fashioned view. We put the issues before people. We don't get into all of the process business. We put the issues before people about what kind of country we want to build, and then the voters choose and the voters decide. And I think that is actually the right way to do it. And I actually think the British people deserve better than a inside the